Congratulations, Bobby.
Oh, for what, Dad?
The organized crime division. Very smart piece of business.
Oh, I thought you in particular would be upset.
Oh, I know we disagreed about you working for McClellan.
Yeah, I disagreed, Dad. At the time, I thought you were going to write me out of the will.
Yeah, but you went ahead with it because you thought it was right. And I admired you then, and I still do.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So, you starting slow? You going after the little fish?
No, I figured Giancana, Trafficante, Marcello, go on some whales. You still there, Dad?
Yeah, I just, Those are tough guys.
Well, sure, I think we'll get them, though. I mean, I had Giancana on the grill in 57.
In every crevice of American governance, organized crime was the silent architect, controlling the country much like today's corporate conglomerates dominate global markets. But this reign of power began to unravel in 1961 with the arrival of Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General. Determined to root out corruption at every level, RFK wasted no time. Within weeks of his swearing in, he sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld by deporting Carlos Marcello, the undisputed kingpin of the Southern Mafia. Marcello's family had wielded control since the 1870s, their influence corrupting the political and economic veins of America's Deep South. By targeting Marcello, Kennedy sent an unmistakable message. No one was untouchable. The fallout was immediate. Shortly after Marcello's deportation, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed spectacularly, prompting the Kennedy brothers to demand answers. What they uncovered was chilling. The CIA's ill-fated operation to overthrow Fidel Castro was riddled with Mafia ties. Figures like Russell Bufalino, Carlos Marcello, and Santo Trafficante were implicated, their hopes pinned on reclaiming Cuba's lucrative casinos and money-laundering operations lost to Castro's revolution. The Mafia, desperate to regain its financial foothold, had gambled on the invasion and lost. The Kennedys, stunned by the depth of this alliance between organized crime and the intelligence community, declared war. The mob reeled under the assault. In just 2 years, the once invincible criminal empire began to crack. Joe Valachi, a madman in the Genovese family, turned informant, pulling the curtain back on the Mafia's operations for the first time in history. What the public learned was staggering. The Mafia wasn't a loose collection of street gangs, but a meticulously organized multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Their grip extended from the gambling dens of Biloxi, Mississippi, to the political dynasties of the Deep South. Biloxi alone was a gold mine, generating untold wealth and shaping the region's politics. But it was also a powder keg. The Mafia's dominance in Biloxi intersected with the burgeoning civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr. This collision of power and progress was destined to end in bloodshed. King's assassination in 1968 was a chilling reminder of how far these men would go to protect their empire. The Biloxi murders became infamous, a brutal display of what happened when the Mafia's interests were threatened. These men didn't play games. Threaten their empire, and they came for your head, literally. The era of 1961 wasn't just a turning point, it was a reckoning. For the first time, the Mafia's multi-generational stranglehold on America faced an adversary willing to expose their secrets, shatter their alliances, and dismantle their empires piece by piece. The battle lines were drawn, and the cost of resistance was measured in blood. By the summer of 1961, President John F. Kennedy was sharpening his focus on the Central Intelligence Agency, still reeling from the Bay of Pigs fiasco. For decades, the CIA had been a shadowy powerhouse, a state within a state, operating with near-absolute autonomy under Allen Dulles. But Kennedy, just months into his presidency, was already signaling that this status quo was untenable. Behind closed doors, he began a quiet but monumental campaign to reshape the agency, sending ripples of unease through the intelligence community. The headlines on August 6, 1961, captured the gravity of the moment. Kennedy administration considers restructuring CIA and intelligence operations. It was a declaration of intent, a warning shot aimed directly at Langley. This wasn't just about cleaning up after Cuba's disastrous invasion. It was about recalibrating America's intelligence machinery for the Cold War, stripping the CIA of its unchecked power, and ensuring it would never again operate as a rogue entity. Central to Kennedy's vision was the dismantling of the CIA's sprawling portfolio. No longer would the agency act as a single monolithic force, responsible for everything from intelligence gathering to covert military operations. Instead, the Kennedy administration proposed slicing the CIA's responsibilities into manageable, specialized functions. One of the boldest ideas on the table involved transferring the preparation of intelligence reports, those critical assessments of hotspots like the Soviet Union or Southeast Asia, from the CIA to a separate agency. This would allow other government entities, such as the State Department or even a newly created office tied to the White House, to control the narrative and ensure a broader perspective. More controversially, Kennedy aimed to remove all military operations from the CIA's domain. The Bay of Pigs debacle had proven, in the starkest terms, that the CIA's foray into warfare was a disaster. Moving forward, paramilitary actions would fall squarely under the Pentagon's jurisdiction. This was a move the Defense Department had initially resisted, wary of absorbing the CIA's failures. But the writing was on the wall. The CIA's days as a militarized spy network were numbered. For Kennedy, reshaping the CIA also meant reshaping its leadership. Allen Dulles, the mastermind of the agency's golden age, was a Cold War relic. His departure was inevitable, though the administration carefully staged his exit to avoid creating a public spectacle. Rumors swirled that Dulles would retire by late fall, just in time for the agency to move into its gleaming new headquarters overlooking the Potomac River. Kennedy's choice for Dulles's successor was as deliberate as the restructuring itself. Fowler Hamilton, a seasoned New York lawyer with intelligence experience, emerged as the frontrunner. Hamilton's clean reputation and distance from the CIA's recent scandals made him a palatable candidate for a public hungry for change. Behind the scenes, however, Kennedy sought not just a fresh face, but someone who could rein in the agency's excesses without dismantling its core. Under Dulles, the CIA director had wielded immense power, overseeing three primary areas: managing the agency's intelligence gathering operations, coordinating activities across government intelligence units, and preparing national security estimates. Kennedy's proposed restructuring would split these responsibilities. Day-to-day operations would be handled by a career intelligence officer in the deputy director role, leaving the director free to focus on interagency coordination and long-term strategy. The administration leaned heavily on experts like General Maxwell Taylor and Dr. James Killian Jr., whose committees delivered a roadmap for reform. Their proposals reflected a cautious yet decisive approach: trim the CIA's reach without crippling its effectiveness. They suggested changes that, while sweeping, would be implemented methodically, ensuring stability during the transition. Not everyone was on board. Splitting the CIA's operational and evaluative functions required congressional approval, a tall order in a legislature wary of tampering with the intelligence apparatus. Critics argued that the CIA's analyses, rooted in input from the Board of Intelligence Estimates, were invaluable precisely because they drew on expertise from across government agencies. Stripping this function from the CIA, they warned, risked creating fragmented, less reliable intelligence. Kennedy's administration, however, was undeterred. The stakes were too high. The Bay of Pigs disaster had exposed cracks in America's intelligence infrastructure, and Kennedy knew those cracks couldn't be patched. They needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. By taking on the CIA, Kennedy was doing more than addressing past failures. He was redefining the boundaries of power in Washington. It was a gamble, one that would reshape the intelligence community and echo through the decades. For the CIA, the message was clear. The days of unchecked authority were over. For Kennedy, it was a calculated risk, one that marked him not just as a leader of vision, but as a president willing to challenge the mightiest institutions of his time. By August of 1961, John Kennedy's battle against the CIA wasn't just about reshaping the agency. It was about dismantling the shadowy alliances that underpinned its power. He had seen enough. Through his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, the president had come to understand the labyrinth of corruption, tying far-right Cuban exiles, former Nazis, and organized crime into a complex web of covert operations. These weren't just ideological soldiers fighting communism. They were mercenaries, leveraging their relationships with the CIA and crime syndicates, like Carlos Marcello's New Orleans Mafia, to fund their efforts. The Kennedy administration began putting the CIA on notice, signaling that their carte blanche in Cuba was over. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion had been a catastrophe, and the underground resistance was left in disarray. On August 5, 1961, headlines revealed that the US government had officially cut off support to Cuban underground forces. The exile community in Miami braced for what came next, but the message was clear. The free flow of arms and resources, once bankrolled by organized crime and CIA funding, had come to an abrupt halt. In the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs disaster, Fidel Castro wasted no time tightening his grip on Cuba. His latest move, nullifying old currency and introducing new bills, crippled the underground resistance's financial network. Funds stashed in foreign banks were suddenly worthless, and the exiles scrambling to reorganize in Miami found themselves backed into a corner. Once a powerful force, capable of sabotage and guerrilla warfare, the resistance was now fractured and weak. Sources suggested it would take months, possibly until October, for the underground to regain even a fraction of its former efficiency. Despite the setbacks, exile leaders clung to optimism. The Revolutionary Council, led by José Miró Cardona, refused to give up. They pledged to find new ways to support their operatives on the island, smuggling funds, supplies, and weapons. Ways will be found. This is only a temporary setback, one leader defiantly declared. But the reality was far grimmer. Without US support, the resistance was operating on borrowed time, its lifeline now reliant on American sympathizers and whatever scraps organized crime could still funnel their way. The deeper Kennedy looked, the uglier the picture became. The Cuban exiles weren't just anti-communist warriors. They were pawns in a much larger game. Many had ties to far-right extremist groups and Nazi collaborators who had fled Europe after World War II. Even more troubling, their operations were bankrolled by figures like Carlos Marcello, whose New Orleans crime family used Guatemala as a staging ground for arms and resource distribution. Marcello's network wasn't an outlier. It was emblematic of a broader Mafia-CIA alliance. Santo Trafficante, the deposed kingpin of Havana's casinos, worked hand-in-hand with Cuban exile groups, eager to reclaim his lost empire. Meyer Lansky, who had once turned Havana into his personal ATM, watched from Miami, quietly supporting efforts to destabilize Castro in hopes of reopening the casinos. The CIA, desperate to overthrow Castro, turned a blind eye to these connections, or worse, actively facilitated them. Kennedy saw the writing on the wall. The CIA's partnerships were no longer just a liability. They were a threat to his administration's credibility. By cutting off support to the Cuban underground, he wasn't just pulling the plug on a failing operation. He was sending a message to the CIA, to organized crime, and to the exiles. The era of unchecked alliances and shadowy backroom deals was over. But Kennedy's move came with risks. The exile community in Miami seethed with frustration, feeling abandoned by the very government that had once promised to liberate Cuba. The Mafia, too, saw the writing on the wall. Organized crime had invested millions into the Cuban resistance, not out of patriotism, but to protect their financial empires. With Kennedy closing the door on Cuba, they feared their influence in Latin America and beyond might crumble. For the moment, the exiles scrambled to adapt. Smuggling networks were retooled, dollars were exchanged for Castro's new pesos, and leaders promised to rebuild. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The resistance was fractured, the Mafia was on edge, and the CIA faced an existential crisis. Kennedy wasn't just fighting communism, he was taking on an entrenched system that had long operated in the shadows, unchecked and untouchable. As autumn approached, the stakes grew higher. The Cuban underground, still reeling from its losses, prepared to strike back. The CIA, its leadership under scrutiny, braced for the fallout of Kennedy's reforms. And in the shadows the Mafia watched, waiting for the moment to reclaim what had been taken from them. Kennedy had thrown the first punch, but the war was far from over. When Carlos Marcello returned from his forced exile, he was a man on the edge, stunned and furious at the chaos unraveling in organized crime. The Kennedy administration's crackdown had severed the lifeline of Cuban exiles, leaving Marcello's CIA connections seething. What most people didn't realize was that, in the 1950s and 1960s, some of the heaviest hitters in the underworld weren't just mobsters. They were covert assets of the Central Intelligence Agency. Men like Meyer Lansky, whose Havana empire was practically a CIA playground, and Carlos Marcello, who controlled the New Orleans docks, a vital pipeline for smuggling weapons to Cuban exile camps in Guatemala and beyond. Marcello's alliance with the CIA had deep roots. It all began when the agency needed his help to overthrow the Guatemalan government and replace it with a regime that danced to Washington's tune. Democracy didn't matter. What mattered was loyalty to the West, hostility to communism, and a willingness to stand against the Soviet Union. Marcello understood the game. This wasn't just organized crime anymore. It was a Cold War battlefield. He knew the fight wasn't about bullets in the streets, but whispers in the shadows, espionage, blackmail, political scandals, and dirty secrets held for leverage. Victory would go to those who struck when the timing was perfect. By 1963, the Kennedys had flipped the establishment on its head. Robert F. Kennedy had labeled the Mafia the rulers of America, branding men like Marcello, Tony Accardo, Santo Trafficante, and Frank Costello as political kingmakers. But the speed and ferocity of the crackdown were unsustainable. It rattled the foundations of both organized crime and the political elite. Robert Kennedy himself began receiving chilling threats, not just from union bosses like Jimmy Hoffa, but from the Mafia and even whispers from within the American government. The empire Robert sought to dismantle wasn't just a criminal underworld, it was a billion-dollar machine entangled with some of the most powerful families in the country. The stakes were laid bare in August 1961, when a series of explosive articles hit the presses. The articles were called "How a $2 Bet Can Get You Killed." It detailed the Mafia's stranglehold on the gambling industry, a global enterprise worth untold fortune. The wife of a wage earner in Syracuse, New York, was desperate. Her husband earned approximately $7,000 a year, but his family was nearly destitute. They were 3 payments behind on a large furniture bill. Their clothes were shabby, their food supply was scant, and their gas and electricity were on the verge of being shut off. This impoverishment, despite what should have been a sufficient income, was caused by one factor. The husband was consumed by a psychological affliction worse, in some ways, than alcoholism. He was possessed by an insatiable urge to gamble. Over the past 18 months, he had returned repeatedly to gambling games run openly in Syracuse by prominent gamblers. These operations were no secret. The head gambler had conducted his business from the same location for 25 years. Despite receiving only 4 minor fines during that time, he had continued to run his illegal enterprise openly, almost as visibly as a legitimate business like a department store. The $7,000 a year wage earner was merely one of countless victims. He scrambled to find money wherever he could. He borrowed his working wife's last penny, took out loans from banks, and even sought credit from a union. In just 18 months, this man, who earned $7,000 a year, had lost $8,000 to gambling. I called the police once about my husband's gambling, and a detective told me it was difficult to make gambling arrests, and that there seemed to be little they could do. The distraught wife wrote in a letter that was later read into the records of the New York State Commission of Investigation in the spring of 1960. Her futile appeal to the authorities, she noted, had only been followed by one final desperate act on her husband's part. The husband had managed to scrape together $1,000 and was heading out to gamble at a local craps game. His wife, frantic and desperate, followed him to the street. She grabbed his arm, pleading and crying, begging him to return home with the money that the family so desperately needed. While this emotional confrontation unfolded on the sidewalk, a Syracuse patrolman pulled up in his patrol car. The wife turned to him for help. I told the policeman that my husband had $1,000 on him, and that he was headed for a gambling house, she later wrote. He had just lost $450 a few days before gambling, and I was determined to stop him from losing any more. The officer took the husband aside, speaking to him privately for a short time. Then he approached the wife with a suggestion. He asked me if it would be all right if my husband kept $100. Would I let him go then? She wrote. Reluctantly she agreed, but instead of taking $100, her husband left with $250. The story didn't end there. My husband told me later that the policeman drove him to the gambling establishment in the patrol car after I had left, she recounted. He said he gave the policeman $10 for the ride. This chilling anecdote encapsulates one of the most profound and troubling issues of our time: the domination of the law by the forces of the lawless. The shocking reality of this corrupt triangle, the professional gambler, the victim, and the complicit police officer, lies not in its uniqueness, but in its ordinariness. It is not an isolated event, but a routine occurrence. For those who doubt the veracity of this stark reality, one need only examine the records of recent decades. These documents lay bare the insidious partnership between the legitimate world and the criminal underworld, a union forged on a national scale during Prohibition. The illicit millions generated during that era empowered organized crime, and this partnership has only grown stronger and more threatening over time. Today, it is sustained by the vast wealth of the gambling industry, a financial powerhouse that dwarfs even the bootlegging profits of the Prohibition era. The scale of the underworld's gambling empire, a behemoth larger than many legitimate industries, has been highlighted in every major study of the problem. In 1960, United States Attorney General William Rogers estimated the total annual income of organized crime in America to be approximately $20 billion, with half of that amount, $10 billion, attributed to gambling. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, offered a similar estimate. He placed the annual income of organized crime at $22 billion, with gambling accounting for $11 billion. To grasp the enormity of these figures, one needs a basis for comparison. In the same era, the total production of the American automobile industry carried a wholesale value of between $8 and $9 billion. In other words, the annual profits from organized gambling roughly equaled the entire income of the automobile manufacturing industry, a cornerstone of American economic prosperity. An extra dimension is given to this portrait of corruption when one examines some of the most important evidence compiled in recent years, developed during the spring and summer of 1960 by the New York State Commission of Investigation. After months of labor sifting through the clues contained in 25,000 pages of reports, the Commission, in late November 1960, disseminated to municipalities across the state all the information it had gathered about bookmakers and their locations. The statistics were staggering. The Commission identified 2,150 bookie locations in 206 communities across 54 of New York's 62 counties, and New York City was not even included. There were 347 spots in Buffalo alone, 196 in Rochester, and 100 in Syracuse. A Brooklyn grand jury that conducted an extensive study of gambling in 1958 concluded that gambling in all its forms represents the treasure chest of the underworld, financing nearly every other type of racket. New York City police statistics do not distinguish unsolved gangland murders from other homicides. Police argue that unless a murder is solved, one cannot be certain of the motive. However, homicide detectives and other investigators privately agree that the toll over the past 10 years is staggering. During that time, there have been at least 200 unsolved gangland murders in New York City alone, with most investigators estimating the number closer to 300. Some of these executions, it is true, stem from rivalries for control of narcotics or other rackets. But the vast majority, as the Brooklyn grand jury discovered, are tied to gambling, around which everything else seems to revolve. Such are the inevitable consequences of the so-called gentleman's racket. When even the shockwaves of public reaction generated by the Kefauver Committee fail to compel the law to act, and when front-page newspaper exposes city after city cannot illuminate the truth, one begins to grasp the iron grip of corruption. It is a hold so strong that even public exposure and humiliation cannot weaken it. As long as this corruption persists, one thing remains certain. A $2 bet means murder. Bookmaking, the most profitable branch of gambling rackets, operates with a degree of secrecy. Yet despite police claims that it is difficult to uncover, it functions almost transparently, as though in a goldfish bowl. This paradox lies in the very nature of business. A bookmaker conducts most of his operations over the telephone, which inherently offers privacy and discretion. If a bookmaker's needs were limited to simply answering the phone and recording bets, it would be the most foolproof racket in existence. However, to successfully run his business, a bookmaker requires critical services that blatantly reveal his activities. A bookmaker's pressing needs are threefold: access to the line, the ability to lay off dangerously heavy bets, and rapid updates on racetrack or sporting event results. Obtaining the line means the bookmaker must maintain constant access to a skilled and reputable handicapper who provides real-time updates on the odds for horse races, baseball games, basketball matches, and college or professional football competitions. This information is essential for the bookmaker to set accurate odds and mitigate risks. The Layoff system enables bookmakers to manage excessive betting on specific outcomes. While small-scale layoff needs can often be addressed within local or regional networks, major events with substantial wagers require more extensive coordination. Millions of dollars may hinge on a single game or race, making the Layoff system a cornerstone of the gambling racket. Joseph P. Manners, of Miami, Florida, a former assistant United States attorney and special assistant to the head of the Criminal Division of the Justice Department for 13 southern states, provided insight into the Layoff system. Manners explained that the process begins with a $2 bettor who places a wager with a small-time bookmaker operating from a corner newsstand. For example, the $2 bettor might place his hopes on a horse named Blackjack in the third race at Hialeah. From there, the system unfolds, connecting small-time operators to larger networks in an intricate web of transactions designed to protect the interests of the gambling syndicate. This system, both local and national in scope, underscores the scale and complexity of the underworld gambling empire. Nothing has changed since the Kefauver Committee's 1951 exposé, except that rackets have grown even more rampant and prolific. In fact, the New York Commission pinpointed the Newport-Covington area, a short taxi ride across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, as the layoff capital of the country. The commission also discovered that some of the very same organizations exposed by Kefauver were still handling large sums of layoff money, their locations, names, and operations virtually unchanged. To fully appreciate the brazenness of this operation, one must understand the intense spotlight that Kefauver shone on the Newport-Covington area. He described it as one of the major gambling hubs in the United States, emphasizing that every type of gambling racket operated openly there. Kefauver also revealed how the layoff moguls enticed legitimate racetracks into colluding with organized crime through what is known as comeback money. The term comeback money is easily explained. Major layoff operators, like bookies further down the chain, aim to protect their guaranteed profits. One method involves sending an agent to a racetrack where a pivotal race is being held, placing $50,000 or even $100,000 into the pari-mutuel machines. This heavy betting drives down the odds on a dangerous horse. If the horse wins, the bookies collect their payout from the track and only pay out their losses at the reduced odds. If the horse loses, the bookies have still balanced their books and safeguarded their profits. This practice has led to active collusion between supposedly legitimate racetracks and organized crime. The tracks entice mob money by offering commissions to brokers as an incentive to funnel large sums into the machines. Cash that ultimately reduces odds and swindles regular bettors at the track. Kefauver denounced this practice, but it appears his efforts fell on deaf ears. Even after a decade, nothing has changed. If anything, the situation has worsened. One of Kefauver's most striking revelations involved the sheer scale of comeback money funneled into pari-mutuel machines nationwide by Newport's gambling czars. The master of this operation, according to Kefauver, was Louis Rosie Rosenbaum of Newport. He ran a 5-telephone layoff network from a small office disguised under the respectable name of the Northern Kentucky Hospitalization Insurance Agency. Even in 1947 and 1948, before the Newport-Covington area had solidified its position as the nation's layoff capital, Rosenbaum had built such a lucrative operation that he paid $200,000 in income taxes. An examination of his phone records revealed that Rosenbaum made 1,053 long-distance calls in a single month. To manage his comeback scheme, Rosenbaum employed 2 agents, Fred Cogan and Richard Reamer, who traveled to racetracks nationwide to place bets. Cogan testified that Rosenbaum paid him $150 a week to stay near a telephone by the racetrack. Throughout the day, Cogan would call Rosenbaum's Kentucky headquarters, collect, and based on Rosenbaum's instructions, place large bets on specific danger horses. Funds for these bets were replenished via money orders, wired through Western Union. A vivid illustration of the harsh truth that gambling is a losing proposition, with winnings rarely offsetting losses. While the Kefauver revelations temporarily curbed activities in the Newport-Covington area during the early 1950s, fear quickly subsided. By 1955, the rackets had rebounded, operating on an even larger scale. In 1957, the Reporter magazine published an article by James Maxwell that attempted to draw national attention to the thriving gambling scene in northern Kentucky. Maxwell described the Beverly Hills Country Club, located just 6 miles from downtown Cincinnati, as a vibrant gambling hotspot featuring craps tables, roulette games, chuck-a-luck sessions, and blackjack. Maxwell also documented a revealing incident that underscored the complicity of local law enforcement. During the Kefauver hearings in 1951, Newport Police Chief George Google feigned ignorance about the state of gambling in his town, claiming, "I've never been in there. All I know is what somebody told me." Yet, just 5 years later, the Louisville Courier-Journal exposed Google's hypocrisy when Newport detective Jack Team raided Glenn Schmidt's Platorium. To his astonishment, Team found Chief Google and 3 fellow detectives on the premises. When a Courier-Journal photographer attempted to document the scene, Chief Google had him arrested and the film destroyed. The fallout was predictable. Chief Google was temporarily suspended, but soon reinstated. Detective Theme, however, paid a harsher price. He was fired for daring to conduct the raid. Given such outcomes, it is no surprise that Newport remains the nerve center of organized gambling in America. Elliot Lombard, chief counsel for the New York Commission of Investigation, estimated that the Newport-Covington region provides the basic insurance for approximately 90% of the nation's bookmaking operations. In a county seat in upstate New York, a criminal court case was nearing the point where it would be submitted to the jury. The judge called a recess before delivering his instructions, and during this break, the lawyer representing the defendant casually strolled out into the courthouse corridor. There he greeted acquaintances, exchanged jokes with friends, and pocketed money from time to time. This was no ordinary lawyer. He was also a bookmaker, and on this particular day, his place of business was in the very halls of the courthouse. While conducting a brisk trade in illegal bets, the lawyer bookmaker noticed an acquaintance and competitor, another bookie. They exchanged pleasantries, and standing in what was supposed to be a hall of justice, the two discussed the irony of their situation. "What a laugh this is," the lawyer bookmaker exclaimed. "Here I am, in the middle of trying a criminal case, and while I'm waiting for the judge to give instructions to the jury, I'm out here taking bets." Both men laughed. The single-profession bookmaker then asked, "Well, is it hard to get convicted for bookmaking?" The lawyer chuckled and replied, "Don't worry about it. They will never convict you. Just be careful. Don't let them see any records." After a moment's thought, he added, "Even if they do catch you, it's not a big deal. They once sent some guys to jail here, but the case ended up being thrown out of court anyway." That same night, New York investigators monitoring a wiretapped phone line overheard the lawyer bookmaker laughing as he recounted this encounter to an acquaintance. William Walsh later testified about the incident during the New York State Commission of Investigation hearings in the spring of 1960. The commissioners, all lawyers themselves, were visibly shocked. "You mean," one of them asked Walsh, "that this lawyer was actually also a bookmaker?" Walsh confirmed that this was indeed true and revealed that the lawyer had subsequently been arrested for bookmaking. Walsh described the situation as the most shocking single example of complete contempt for the law uncovered during the New York investigation. The probes revealed an inherent dishonesty in gambling operations. The romanticized notion of the gentleman lawbreaker gambler quickly disintegrated under scrutiny. Evidence showed that gambling is a dirty business, operated by criminals who have no intention of giving their victims a fair chance. For professional operators, gambling is a misnomer. There is no actual gamble from their perspective. Instead, there is systematic and ruthless exploitation of those foolish enough to believe they have a shot at winning. While some may speak of honest houses or fair percentages, the investigations uncovered rampant cheating. The New York raids vividly illustrated how these games were rigged. In one bookmaker's establishment, authorities seized an 80-page catalogue produced by a Chicago firm specializing in crooked gambling devices. The firm openly disclaimed any intention to defraud, but brazenly detailed how its products could help swindle unsuspecting players. The catalogue advertised crooked dice, loaded dice, dice designed to roll specific numbers more frequently, marked decks of cards, card-holding devices, and even contact lenses for reading marked cards. The rigged dice were sold for $10 to $30 per set. One advertisement read, "We cannot recommend these dice too highly for taking care of dangerous frontline play." Another claimed, "These dice will stand close inspection and get by in fast company." Yet another boasted, "This set will give the banker or fader a very strong percentage, no switching required." The firm also promoted a device that could be attached to the lower part of a coat, allowing the user to discreetly swap out dice during gameplay. Lower your hand, and presto, like magic, You've switched another pair of dice into your hand, the catalogue assured customers. It takes very little practice to become an expert switcher in just a few minutes. The catalogue also featured rigged playing cards. One product included contact lens cards that cannot be seen with the naked eye. These cards appeared identical to a standard deck, but contained hidden symbols, visible only when viewed through special contact lenses. The company offered new improved triple contact lenses for $160 a pair, an indication of how valuable such tools were to con artists. The existence of an 80-page catalogue devoted exclusively to rigged devices, distributed nationwide, demonstrated the massive scale of corruption within gambling. Such a business could only thrive if gambling operations across the country were crooked on a grand scale. The probes revealed a disturbing war between two systems of enforcement, the rule of law and the rule of the underworld's guns. Time and again, the terror imposed by criminals outweighed society's justice. Potential witnesses were silenced, and in cases involving high-ranking gangsters, key witnesses were often erased. Rarely was a gangland murder solved. This system of terror underpinned the multi-billion-dollar gambling racket in America. The New York investigation traced the chain of corruption from corner bookies to the highest levels of syndicate power. Despite the evidence, the courts of New York performed poorly following the meticulously executed raids against bookmakers. Punishments were so lenient that the judiciary seemed to treat the offenders as petty criminals caught in minor altercations. By April 1960, when the New York Commission held its public hearings, 52 cases had been resolved, 51 through guilty pleas and 1 by dismissal. Among those convicted, 41 received fines ranging from $5 to $500, totaling only $11,690. In 5 cases, sentences or fines were suspended entirely, meaning the offenders faced no consequences whatsoever. Only 2 men were sentenced to jail, and even they served a mere 30 days. William Walsh summed it up. In many instances, these bookmakers had extensive criminal records, ranging from murder to narcotics trafficking and white slavery. Despite these records, they received only minimal fines. Indeed, the average citizen might face harsher penalties for speeding or littering than these bookmakers faced for their crimes. While ignorance of the gambling problem has been used to excuse judicial leniency in the past, there can be no such excuse moving forward. The most powerful crime syndicate in the United States has historically been rooted in New York City. It should come as no surprise, then, that when 150 delegates to a High Council of Crime gathered in Worcester, Massachusetts, in December 1959, their ties to the top hierarchy in New York were unmistakably close. New York's influence in organized crime is a matter of historical record. It was from New York that Johnny Torrio and Al Capone went west to consolidate the mobs of Chicago. It was the New York syndicate that dispatched Bugsy Siegel to California to develop the rackets there. And when Siegel became too independent and was removed, it was the New York mob that appointed his successor to safeguard syndicate interests in Las Vegas, the gambling mecca he had pioneered. These events, along with operations in Las Vegas, Louisiana, Florida, and Havana, Cuba, have repeatedly underscored the long reach and central importance of the New York mob in the criminal underworld. To understand the modern New York syndicate, one must first grasp the history from which it evolved. Today's New York mob is the heir to one of the most formidable criminal organizations America has ever known, the Frank Costello Joe Adonis Combine, which dominated organized crime for nearly 2 decades. During the Kefauver investigation of 1951, Costello and Adonis became household names. They were denounced as rulers of the Eastern Syndicate, and extensive details of their influence and criminal ties were laid bare. Yet even then, the full story of their reign was never fully revealed. For nearly a decade, Costello and Adonis ran an empire of crime with near total immunity from the law, a level of protection so comprehensive that even law enforcement became a shield for their operations. The mastermind behind this unprecedented immunity was Joe Adonis, born Joseph Dotto in Italy. To the underworld, he was known simply as Joe A. Standing 5 feet 7.5 inches tall and weighing 190 pounds, Adonis projected the image of a refined gentleman. With his hard brown eyes, greying dark hair, and impeccable taste in conservative, expensive clothing, Adonis cultivated an air of sophistication. He spoke softly, conducted himself with polished manners, and exuded the charm of a millionaire businessman. Adonis had grown up on the rough streets of South Brooklyn and harbored a single ambition: to become a gangster. With one of the sharpest minds in organized crime, he rose rapidly through the ranks, becoming an intimate ally of Charles Lucky Luciano, the first overall czar of New York's rackets, and later Frank Costello, Luciano's successor. Adonis wielded power not just through his intellect, but through brute force. He commanded the enforcement arm of the syndicate, including the infamous Murder, Inc. This assassination squad, led by Albert Anastasia, carried out killings across the country to enforce syndicate directives. While Anastasia managed the squad's day-to-day operations, Joe Adonis was the ultimate authority behind its lethal reach. As the law began closing in on Murder Incorporated during the 1940s, Brooklyn became inhospitable for Adonis. He shifted his base of operations across the Hudson River to Bergen County, New Jersey, just beyond the jurisdiction of New York authorities. There, within sight of Manhattan, Adonis established a nerve center for Eastern rackets at a dingy tavern called Duke's, located at 783 Palisades Avenue in Cliffside, directly across from the Palisades amusement park. From this unassuming location, Adonis presided over the Big Five, a council of crime that coordinated syndicate activities across the region. This council was the executive board of the underworld, holding regular meetings and overseeing decisions critical to the operation of the multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise. The public perception of organized crime is often skewed by sensationalized events like the 1957 Appalachian meeting, which brought 60 Mafia leaders together in New York. While such gatherings made headlines, they were far from unique. Large-scale crime, like any major business, requires planning, executive leadership, and operational coordination. The underworld relies on board meetings and strategy sessions even more than legitimate enterprises, given the complexities of illegal activities and the need for secrecy. The Big Five meetings at Duke's were not just about day-to-day operations, but also grand strategy. Present at these sessions were some of the biggest names in organized crime, including Frank Costello, Abner Longy Zwillman from New Jersey, Meyer Lansky, Gerardo Jerry Catena, and others. Together, they mapped the syndicate's future and ensured its dominance in gambling, narcotics, and other rackets. When the Kefauver hearings of 1951 disrupted the old order, many top figures, including Frank Costello and Joe Adonis, saw their influence wane. The least conspicuous member of the Big Five, Anthony Tony Bender, Strollo, emerged as a key figure. A nightclub owner and real estate mogul, Strollo operated quietly but effectively, maintaining significant influence on the Hudson County waterfront and in Lower Manhattan. For over 2 decades, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics identified Strollo as the chief lieutenant of Vito Genovese, the Mafia chieftain. Today, the criminal axis in New York pivots around the Strollo-Genovese combine. Key figures like Mike Miranda, Vincent Vinnie Bruno Mauro, and Carmine Galente, one of the most feared mobsters in the East, remain closely linked to this power structure. Despite the disruption caused by high-profile investigations, the New York mob remains entrenched. While figures like Vito Genovese have been sidelined by convictions, the syndicate continues to adapt, refining its methods, but maintaining its grip on lucrative rackets. Investigators are well aware that the gambling operations in New York worth millions annually, remain the cornerstone of the mob's vast empire. Though names and faces change, the New York syndicate endures, reaping millions each year from an illegal empire that bankrolls its influence and ensures its dominance in the underworld. The underworld's gambling billions wield such overwhelming influence over politics and law enforcement that in many vital areas of America, the legal system is effectively beyond redemption. Corruption has burrowed so deeply into the fabric of law enforcement that even when officers are confronted directly with evidence of criminal activity, they remain blind to it, unable or unwilling to act. This determined indifference is widely apparent, but nowhere is it more glaring than in certain power centers around Chicago. Just across the Chicago city limits, in Cicero, the heirs of Al Capone preside over a gambling empire that has defied time, investigation, and repeated exposure. In August 1956, Virgil Peterson and the Chicago Crime Commission launched a sustained campaign to make law enforcement officials aware of syndicate boss Tony Accardo's plans to reopen multi-million-dollar gambling operations. Cook County's sheriff at the time was Joseph Lohman, a former University of Chicago professor, a renowned criminologist, and a police consultant of national repute. Lohman, who would later become Illinois State Treasurer, initially acted on Peterson's information. He raided a suspected gambling house, making several arrests. However, as Peterson reported, Lohman's interest quickly waned. The same gambling operation reopened on the very premises that had been raided, operated there for several weeks, and then moved to Cicero, a long-standing haven for Capone-era activities. In 1956, the Chicago Crime Commission noted that Cicero continued to provide a friendly atmosphere for syndicate-run gambling operations. At least one gangland murder that year was directly linked to these gambling enterprises. By 1957, the Commission intensified its focus on Cicero's wide-open gambling. Over the course of the year, it sent 9 detailed letters to the Cook County Sheriff's Office, each containing specific information about ongoing gambling operations. One major gambling establishment had operated openly at the same location for more than a decade, its address and operators publicly exposed during the Kefauver hearings. Yet, nothing had changed. The gambling spot continued to run exactly as it always had. In October 1958, the Commission sent a letter to Sheriff Lohman, noting acidly, "Many of the gambling places listed have been known to your office for years, yet these places continue to operate without fear of raids or arrests." Sheriff Lohman conducted over 1,500 gambling and vice raids during his tenure, an energetic show of force that earned him praise as the best sheriff Cook County ever had. However, this effort was largely superficial. The most lucrative operations of the syndicate remained untouched, and the Capone mob's major enterprises faced little interference. Publicity means little to organized crime when its operators know they are immune to the one thing that matters: enforcement of the law. As Willie Moretti, a notorious mob figure, once boasted, "We just fade and fade." Peterson's frustrations were compounded in October 1959, when news broke of a European tour taken by Tony Accardo and his wife, accompanied by Chicago Police Lieutenant Anthony DeGrazio and his wife. When confronted with public criticism, Lieutenant DeGrazio dismissed the controversy. He pointed out that Accardo had been an usher at his wedding in 1927, and that DeGrazio, then a sergeant, had accompanied Accardo and his bride on their honeymoon in 1934. "What is wrong with associating with Tony Accardo?" DeGrazio asked. "He has never been convicted of anything." While technically accurate, this statement highlighted the limits of the justice system. Tony Accardo had been accused of nearly every conceivable crime, including forgery, perjury, tax evasion, hijacking, bootlegging, robbery, kidnapping, extortion, gambling, narcotics trafficking, labor racketeering, pandering, and murder. Yet the harshest penalty he had ever faced was a $200 fine for disorderly conduct. Accardo's immense wealth, derived from his illegal enterprises, had long been a source of curiosity for investigators. He resided in a 22-room mansion in River Forest, Illinois, featuring gold-plated plumbing and a 6-foot-high electrically wired iron fence. The property, valued at $500,000, stood as a testament to his success. Investigations revealed that Accardo and Jake Guzik had split $278,000 in profits from a single South Side policy wheel in 1949. Additionally, Accardo was tied to the notorious Owl Club, which grossed approximately $2 million in horse racing bets between 1948 and 1949. In 1958, the federal government attempted to collect an additional $90,565 in taxes from Accardo. However, the United States Tax Court reduced the claim following a Supreme Court decision allowing gangsters to deduct business expenses associated with their illicit activities. In 1959, federal prosecutors began investigating Accardo's income tax returns, suspecting him of fraud. Between 1956 and 1958, Accardo reported an income of $179,273 as a sales promotion man for a beer distributor. He also claimed a business expense of $3,993, 90% of the cost of operating his fire-engine red Mercedes sports car. Federal prosecutors argued that this salary was a scheme to provide Accardo with legitimate spending money, shielding his illegal income from scrutiny. As the investigation gained traction, violence followed. On July 19, 1959, Joseph Bronge, a beer distributor, was fatally shot after being indicted for perjury over alleged gangster ties. On January 20, 1960, Arthur Adler, who had been questioned about mob ownership of cafes, disappeared. His body was later discovered in a West Side sewer. Despite these setbacks, federal prosecutors pressed forward. In April 1960, Accardo was indicted on 3 counts of income tax evasion. By November, he was convicted. Judge Julius Hoffman sentenced Accardo to 6 years in prison, fined him $15,000, and ordered him to cover the full costs of the 9-week trial, an amount described as astronomical. In delivering the sentence, Judge Hoffman declared, "The only conclusion we can draw from the enormous income generated by professional gambling, which permeates all levels of society, is that organized gambling is a malignancy and a national calamity." This case highlighted the immense power of the underworld and the monumental challenges faced by law enforcement in combating the corruption fueled by gambling billions. When a gunman shot Frank Costello around 11 at night on May 2, 1957, the nation caught an inadvertent glimpse of the connections between organized crime and Las Vegas, Nevada, a city renowned for its legalized gambling, which was supposedly above reproach. The shooting occurred as Costello entered his apartment building at 115 Central Park West in New York. The bullet grazed behind his right ear, sending a clear message. Costello had been deposed as the czar of the New York underworld. The shooting also revealed a darker truth about Nevada's legal gambling industry and its deep ties to the American underworld. When Costello was taken to the hospital, New York detectives searched for the contents of his jacket pockets. Among the items found was $800 in cash, and a note containing figures so massive they rivaled entries in New York City's $2 billion annual budget. The note detailed the following financial breakdown, carefully recording the casino's earnings and payments. Gross casino win as of April 26, 1957, $651,284. Casino win after deducting markers. IOU receipts. $434,695. Slot machine wins. $63,844. Outstanding markers. $153,000. $745. The note also outlined specific payments. Mike, $150 per week totaling $600. Jake, $100 per week totaling $400. L, $30,000. H, $9,000. The handwriting on the note belonged to two individuals. When detectives questioned Costello about the note, he feigned ignorance, claiming he had no idea how it ended up in his pocket. Later, when brought before a grand jury, Costello invoked the Fifth Amendment. Despite his lack of cooperation, investigators determined that the note detailed financial records related to an underworld investment in one of the newest and most luxurious Las Vegas casinos, the Tropicana Hotel, which had opened just weeks earlier. Two major stockholders in the Tropicana were Chicagoans known for their political connections: Louis Lederer and Charles Babe Barron. Lederer, listed as holding $180,000 worth of Tropicana stock, had a history tied to organized crime through his previous association with Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky. Although Lederer and Barron were the public faces of the Tropicana, the casino's operations were heavily influenced by Phil "Dandy" Phil Castile, a partner of Costello, Lansky, and Carlos Marcello in New Orleans' notorious Beverly Club. To secure a Nevada gambling license, the Tropicana had to obscure Castell's involvement. Castell officially relinquished his stake in the casino, signing an agreement that required the Tropicana to pay him $320,000 in installments of $40,000 annually, plus additional expenses incurred during the hotel's construction. When the Tropicana opened in April 1957, its financial ties to Castell and Costello remained intact. Investigators later compared the figures from the note found in Costello's pocket to the casino's reported earnings during its first 24 days of operation. The totals matched exactly, exposing Tropicana's ties to organized crime. Nevada's legalization of gambling in 1931 had turned the state into a haven for the American underworld. The desert state's isolated location and lack of competition made it a lucrative oasis for organized crime, with Las Vegas serving as the crown jewel. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, co-founder of New York's Bug and Meyer gang, alongside Meyer Lansky, was among the first to recognize Nevada's potential. In the 1930s, Siegel was sent west by the New York and Chicago syndicates to organize California's criminal enterprises. Siegel quickly embedded himself in Hollywood's elite circles, rubbing shoulders with movie stars like George Raft and gaining membership at the exclusive Hillcrest Country Club. Behind his glamorous image, however, Siegel was shaking down film industry figures. Investigators later uncovered ledgers documenting loans totaling $400,000 that Siegel had extorted from Hollywood stars, often leveraging his control over the extras union to threaten boycotts of films. By the early 1940s, Siegel turned his attention to Nevada. Gambling in the state had been legalized, but was still run on a small local scale. Siegel, with his experience in eastern casinos, saw an untapped gold mine. He first acquired stakes in two existing Las Vegas casinos, the Golden Nugget and the Frontier Club. These ventures were merely stepping stones for a grander vision, the Flamingo Hotel. Siegel envisioned the Flamingo as a lavish resort dedicated to high-stakes gambling. The project broke ground on the 3-mile strip connecting McCarran Airport to Las Vegas. Siegel hired contractor Del Webb, later co-owner of the New York Yankees, to bring his vision to life. However, the Flamingo's opulence came at a staggering cost. Construction expenses spiraled out of control, with Siegel pouring over $1 million of his own money and at least $5 million from syndicate backers into the project. At one point, Siegel's advisor informed him that even more money was needed to complete the casino. Siegel left for New York and returned days later with 2 satchels containing $400,000 in cash, an indication of the syndicate's deep financial involvement. Despite Flamingo's grandeur, Siegel's reckless spending and ambition alienated his syndicate backers. He angered his associates further by declaring his intention to keep all West Coast rackets, including the race-wire service, under his sole control. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Siegel was assassinated while sitting on the couch in his Beverly Hills home, a victim of his own hubris. Siegel's death did little to slow the underworld's domination of Las Vegas. Figures like Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and their associates in Chicago and New York continued to control Nevada's lucrative gambling industry, using the state's legalization of gambling as a facade for their operations. The Tropicana Hotel, like the Flamingo before it, became a testament to the seamless integration of legal gambling and organized crime, where profits from the casino floor flowed directly into the coffers of America's most powerful criminal syndicates. The glittering facade of Las Vegas hides a troubling truth. The capital of legalized gambling is deeply intertwined with illegal activities stretching across the United States. The control exercised from Las Vegas, linking it to syndicates nationwide, has been exposed through numerous federal investigations. Let's delve into some chilling examples. In the autumn of 1957, federal agents raided a massive Layoff headquarters operated by organized crime in Terre Haute, Indiana. This operation served as a clearinghouse for bets funneled from across the country. A federal grand jury in Indianapolis later heard testimony from 170 witnesses spanning 40 states, illustrating the vast reach of the syndicate's operations. Federal accountants revealed that over just 3 months, this Layoff center handled more than $3,363,000 in bets. 8 operators were convicted, and their backgrounds underscored the amalgamation of mob interests. 2 were tied to the Chicago outfit, 1 was from Detroit, 3 were local Indiana contacts, and 2 hailed from Las Vegas. Federal investigations repeatedly pinpoint Las Vegas as a nerve center for organized crime. The New York City policy investigation revealed that the masterminds behind illegal gambling often directed operations from hubs in Miami and Nevada. Joseph Manners, testifying before the New York State investigation, described how calls to check on Layoff operations in Biloxi and Covington originated from Las Vegas, a clear indication of top-level mob control in the city. One of the most telling discoveries came from Milton Wessel's rackets-busting team in Florida. Agents stopped a courier returning from the Caribbean with an innocent-looking suitcase. The courier, none other than Jake Lansky, was carrying $200,000 in cash and $50,000 in checks. While the cash's destination remained unclear, the checks were unequivocally tied to a Florida agent representing Las Vegas interests. While the nation pays for Nevada's flirtation with legalized gambling, the state's cost is even greater. Las Vegas's allure, its stage shows, high-profile entertainers, and neon glamour, belies the misery and desperation that thrive in its shadows. Pawnshops in Nevada bustle as frantically as the casinos. Heartbreaking stories abound of tourists losing everything in the pursuit of luck. A common sight is a man attempting to pawn his eyeglasses, only to be told that regulations forbid lending against essential health items such as glasses, hearing aids, and dentures. One poignant example of gambling's devastation involved a young couple on their honeymoon. After arriving in Reno, they decided to test their luck with their savings. Predictably, the groom began losing. Desperation took hold, and he gambled away their entire bankroll. Determined to recoup his losses, he sold their car and lost those proceeds as well. The bride took a job as a waitress to support them, but even this could not deter her husband's spiral. He hocked their clothing and luggage, leaving them penniless. They were eventually evicted and spent 2 nights in a bus station before the bride swallowed her pride and wired her parents in Oklahoma for help. Such stories are tragically routine in Nevada, where the heartbreak of gambling addiction has become so common that it no longer makes headlines. As journalist Ed Reed laments, "We're stuck with this thing. The temptations are too much for almost anyone. He adds bitterly, even church bishops play the slots. Local Catholic charities spend nearly their entire budget getting stranded people out of town, providing gasoline, food baskets, and cash. The social toll is staggering. Las Vegas and Reno maintain disproportionately large police forces for cities their size, reflecting the difficulty of maintaining order in a gambling society. Crimes born of monetary desperation, robberies, burglaries, and even suicides are rampant. Reno faced a major scandal in 1960 when 7 police officers were suspended and 6 confessed to participating in a burglary ring that looted 10 businesses. The suicide rate in Nevada often doubles the national average, underscoring the despair that runs parallel to its glittering image. The ties from Las Vegas to the rest of the country weave a web of corruption and exploitation, suggesting that the price of Nevada's legalized gambling experiment is not borne by the state alone. It is a burden shouldered by the entire nation. Gambling has long been championed as a thrilling, potentially lucrative pastime, but history paints a grim picture of its devastating consequences, even when cloaked in the guise of legality. Wherever gambling has been legalized, the results reveal its inescapable flaws: corruption, destitution, and a trail of shattered lives. Before achieving statehood in 1912, New Mexico and Arizona experimented with legalized gambling, allowing establishments to operate with the payment of license fees. The result was an explosion of gambling dens, between 700 and 1,000, crowded with miners, cowboys, Chinese laborers, and Mexicans. However, investigations exposed widespread cheating, with Governor Herbert Hageman of New Mexico, 1906-1907, pointing out that players had an astonishing 250% worse odds of winning compared to European casinos, which still turned massive profits for their operators. The ensuing chaos was inevitable. Fleeced patrons frequently retaliated with violence, shooting up the establishments that had robbed them blind. When these territories became states, both quickly outlawed gambling. More than 3 decades later, inspired by Nevada's apparent success with legalized gambling, Idaho and Montana revisited the idea. In 1947, Idaho passed a law permitting municipalities to license slot machines under local option rules. Towns like Twin Falls embraced this opportunity, licensing machines and taking 50% of gross proceeds after maintenance costs. But the experiment quickly spiraled into corruption. An underworld syndicate seized control of many slot machines, and a police patrolman was convicted of extorting $1,000 from a cafe owner to secure his slot machine license. The human toll was equally dire. Relief rolls grew as impoverished citizens gambled away their meager incomes and armed robberies surged. By January 1949, Twin Falls had cancelled all slot machine licenses, and other cities like Boise and Nampa followed suit. Montana's experience was eerily similar. In 1947, the state legalized punchboards and permitted slot machines in private clubs, resulting in the rapid proliferation of gambling establishments, over 600 by 1949. These private clubs brazenly advertised with signs inviting the public, undermining the legitimacy of their status. Governor Sam Ford publicly regretted signing the slot machine and punchboard laws, admitting they had plunged the state into chaos. Both states abandoned legalized gambling shortly thereafter. History repeatedly proves that gambling, even under legal oversight, is inherently corrupt. Every large lottery or casino eventually descends into fraud, racketeering, and exploitation. Legalized gambling may promise fairness, but its foundations are built on falsehoods. The very term gamble implies a fair or sporting chance, yet nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, the odds are heavily skewed against the player. Even in legal systems like pari-mutuel horse racing, approximately 15% of every bet is siphoned off for taxes and operational costs before odds are calculated. Those betting with bookies fare even worse, losing an additional 5% as the bookies manipulate odds further in their favor. For decades, Professor Philip G. Fox of the University of Wisconsin studied gambling odds and published his findings in the Saturday Evening Post. His conclusion was unequivocal. No one who gambles regularly, whether on horses, sports, or casino games, stands a chance of winning in the long run. The longer a player participates, the worse their losses become, thanks to fixed odds that ensure the house's profit. Even consistently betting on favourites in horse races results in losses. While 35% of favourites may win, their payouts are so minimal that they fail to compensate for the losses incurred on the 65% that don't. Other gambling formats, like football pools and slot machines, are even more predatory. Slot machines, for instance, are programmed to guarantee a profit for their operators. In reputable Las Vegas establishments, machines are set to retain 6% of all money gambled. However, in less scrupulous venues, machines may be rigged to keep as much as 85%, leaving only 15% for payouts. Despite overwhelming evidence, the general public clings to the misconception that gambling offers a sporting chance. They equate it with innocent games of chance or private bets, failing to grasp that the odds are systematically stacked against them. The reality is stark. Gambling is a sophisticated racket designed to extract wealth from the public while enriching a select few. Whether legal or illegal, its legacy is one of poverty, crime, and shattered lives, a truth that history repeatedly underscores, but society stubbornly ignores. Today, the American public faces a stark choice: demand integrity in public office and strict enforcement of anti-gambling laws rooted in historical lessons, or surrender to an open embrace of gambling, accepting the moral decay of a society turned parasitic. Yet the narrative often presented suggests there is no real choice, that gambling is inevitable and harmless. In 1950, Governor Thomas Dewey of New York framed the issue in uncompromising terms. It is fundamentally immoral to encourage the belief by the people as a whole in gambling as a source of family income. It would be immoral for government to make available to all of its people a statewide gambling apparatus, with the implied assumption that the gains of chance were a fair substitute for or supplement to the honorable business of producing the goods and services by which the people of the nation live. For decades, Florida served as a haven for gambling syndicates and organized crime, becoming the winter home for the nation's most notorious racketeers. Illegal casinos, bookmaking rings, and numbers of operations thrived with little to no resistance from authorities. In a Saturday Evening Post article, Governor Leroy Collins of Florida reflected on the pervasive attitude. There was an attitude in our state for a long time that to attract the tourists who contribute so vitally to our economy, we had to give them the opportunity to live dangerously and squander their money recklessly. Collins vehemently rejected this mindset, believing that tourists fleeced by professional gamblers would leave with bitter memories and no affection for Florida. More importantly, he feared the corrosive influence of big-time racketeers on the moral welfare of Florida's citizens. His administration passed laws banning slot machines and strengthened anti-bookie statutes. While Florida didn't transform overnight, the results were clear. Communities like Daytona Beach experienced an uptick in tourism after cracking down on gambling, attracting families and long-term visitors rather than transient fortune hunters. The normalization of gambling has fostered a society indifferent to its dangers. It doesn't really matter, some claim. But it certainly matters when a lawyer in upstate New York takes bets in a courthouse corridor. A desk lieutenant runs a bookmaking operation out of police headquarters. Notorious figures like Joe Adonis in New Jersey, Carlos Marcello in Louisiana, and Tony Accardo in Chicago operate with near impunity, often with local law enforcement on their payroll. These examples are not isolated. they point to a deeper societal rot. The most direct remedy lies in the hands of the public. Don't bet with a bookie. Don't play slot machines. Don't patronize professional gambling establishments. If Americans stopped supporting these enterprises, the golden stream of cash that finances bribery, narcotics trafficking, and murder would dry up. Organized crime would face a rapid and devastating collapse. While this solution may seem utopian, it isn't impossible. Millions of Americans gamble casually, unaware of the societal harm they enable. With greater awareness, these individuals could significantly reduce the underworld's grip. Corruption on a local level is bad enough, but the true menace lies in the syndicate's ability to operate across state lines with impunity. Federal agencies, with their national jurisdiction, are the only entities capable of addressing these sprawling conspiracies. Consider how gambling syndicates thrive. In Wilmington, Delaware, tolling operations flourish. In Minneapolis and Chicago, The Line feeds a national network of illegal bookmaking. These examples are not isolated. They point to a deeper societal rot. The most direct remedy lies in the hands of the public. Don't bet with a bookie. Don't play slot machines. Don't patronize professional gambling establishments. If Americans stopped supporting these enterprises, the golden stream of cash that finances bribery, narcotics trafficking, and murder would dry up. Organized crime would face a rapid and devastating collapse. While this solution may seem utopian, it isn't impossible. Millions of Americans gamble casually, unaware of the societal harm they enable. With greater awareness, these individuals could significantly reduce the underworld's grip. Corruption on a local level is bad enough, but the true menace lies in the syndicate's ability to operate across state lines with impunity. Federal agencies with their national jurisdiction are the only entities capable of addressing these sprawling conspiracies. Consider how gambling syndicates thrive. In Wilmington, Delaware, tolling operations flourish. In Minneapolis and Chicago, The Line feeds a national network of illegal bookmaking. In Biloxi, Mississippi, and Covington, Kentucky, Layoff operations underpin multi-billion-dollar gambling enterprises. Such activities are so intricately balanced on the edge of legality that local authorities struggle to prosecute them. Yet, viewed as part of a nationwide conspiracy, they become undeniably criminal. The path forward requires a collective awakening to the true cost of gambling. Every $2 bet placed with a bookie, every slot machine pull, and every wager in a professional gambling trap fuels a system that leads to corruption, narcotics trafficking, and murder.